Well, this is good. I want to talk about. So I want to. I think we can come back to nuclear at the end. I'd like to talk a little about COVID.
Let's.
And censorship. So I stayed out of COVID for the most part. I wrote an early piece that's basically was pretty much echoing the mainstream view, which was that we needed to take some pretty significant actions.
Yep.
This was in March, April 2020. And then I decided to go write San Francisco, and I basically stopped working on it. For the campaign, I had a lot of people that were, and you may know that Steve Kirsch is on my board, my nonprofit. Oh, yeah. So Steve Kirsch is a longtime friend and supporter, and has been on my board of directors, and I know he's a friend of yours now. Mm-hmm. But I knew very little about it. I stayed mostly out of it. I saw that you and Claire were fighting. I saw this thing going on.
I was trying to be nice. Claire was fighting.
Yeah. So, I'm interested in how you look back on the last couple of years and what you take from it. I will say I have been censored on Facebook for climate information. And then the only time I've ever been censored on Instagram was just a week ago for posting images of my tweets saying that mask mandates were pseudoscience. And what I tweeted out was from the New York Times. It was from David Leonhardt, his piece on mask mandates. So it's the only thing I've ever had censored. Tell me what when you look back over the last 2 years, and also just catch me with your views, because I'm sure I know your viewers know, but catch me on that, and looking back, and how would you summarize it?
There are a couple different threads there. Yeah. One, personally, I don't think I had any choice about what I did. Mm-hmm. I'm sure there are small things I could alter. There are a couple things I got wrong, which I wish I hadn't, but I thought, actually, in light of how much one could get wrong, that actually we got almost everything right. Okay. And that's important. But basically, when I came into the public eye, I came into the public eye for being the person who, faced with an accusation of racism, just said, no, that's not true. Right. I can establish that if you're willing to listen. And so the point is, I got famous, as it were, for saying difficult, true things. Yes. That's what I always do. Right. And the problem is, sometimes it wins you friends. Mm-hmm. And then it will turn some of those people to enemies on the next topic. Right. And my feeling is, look, you either signed up for somebody who will do that, in which case, there's nothing that guards me against being wrong other than the fact that I try really hard not to be wrong, because, frankly, reversing course is painful and costly. But, you're either signed up for somebody who will say the uncomfortable stuff, no matter how many people disagree with them, and no matter how forcefully, or you're not really on board with that. And so my feeling is, okay, I did what I always do. In this case, it had terrible effects in many regards. Heather and I lost more than half our family income in a single hour as YouTube demonetized both our channels. They remain demonetized. Wow. For things that we were right about. Right? But then you had a best-selling book. Best-selling book. We don't know how well it would have done if we hadn't been actively accused of spreading misinformation, which has now been redefined by the federal government, by the Department of Homeland Security, as malinformation. Mm-hmm. Have you gotten the memo? No. Oh, it's marvelous. It's marvelous. There are now 3 types of informational terrorism. One of them is misinformation. That's when you're incorrect about something. The next one is disinformation. That's when you're incorrect and you know it. Intentionally. And malinformation is when you're correct in a way that causes distrust of the government. So that might be where you ended up running afoul of Instagram or... Wow. Well, so back me up in terms of... all right, what did you get right? What did you get wrong? And what is the jury still out about on? Okay. Well, there's a question about what the evidence says. Yeah. There's a question about what people have now acknowledged. And there are big gaps here. So I would say that there are several major threads to the conversation. The first one is, where did the virus come from? I was very early on lab leak. I won't go all the way back into the history, but it became obvious very quickly that while some of the evidence was ambiguous, all of the evidence that wasn't ambiguous pointed to the lab and not to the wet market or to a cave. And, I said so. And I was pretty clear that I wasn't 100% sure of anything, but...
So the three big issues, there's origin, masks, lockdowns, and vaccines. Would you say those are the four big issues related?
No, I would say the three biggest issues are origin, early treatment, and vaccine safety and effectiveness. I would say there is a fourth that the public has yet to really understand is even an issue, but it is, which is the evolution of viral variants. Where are they coming from? Why do they look the way they do? What would we do if we wanted to shut them down? So that's a fourth thread. And then there's the lockdown and mask question. Masks are actually one thing I got wrong. Early on, I thought I was one of the first people anywhere that I was aware of who was masking. In fact, at the point that it became clear COVID was going to transform the way we were interacting, at least for the time being, we had our studio was downtown, and my son and I would go late at night when we wouldn't interact with anybody, and we took all of the equipment to do our podcast out of this office space that we knew we were abandoning, and we moved it into our house, and we would go to the Home Depot and we would buy the stuff for our set, and we built this thing. And I got a reputation as the bandit of the hardware store because I was masking, right? Nobody else was masking. And then,
this is all in Portland?
Yeah.
Nobody's masking in Portland?
Early on? No. I was masked way before they were.
And is your view now that masks, do like N95s? Are you think N95s don't work? Or?
I wouldn't say N95s don't work. I would say if properly worn, N95 masks have some effect. But the mask mandates don't require an N95 mask. The cloth masks don't seem to work at all. I was struck
on social media how much people mixed up masks and mask mandates. That they're the same thing and they're not. So that's easy. So then what about the vaccines?
Well, hold on. Masks, I got wrong. Lockdowns, I think I got right, which was there was a place for lockdowns, but they needed to be more intense than they were. They needed to be short duration, and they needed to be paired with excellent quality testing, which frankly we still don't have. Which I don't know. I can't imagine why we don't have it. I think that's a problem money would solve, and the fact that we haven't dedicated enough money to have tests that are worth anything is conspicuous to me. But I would have had, let's say, a painful 6-week, very intense lockdown. And the reason for that is that gives it enough time. Most of the transmission was at home. So 6 weeks gives it enough time to burn through, places where we are corralled together, such that at the point you lift that 6-week mandate, you have a small number of places where active COVID still exists. And if you had good testing, you could figure out where they were, and you could apply some very local solutions so that the rest of us could have gone back to life. Given that we never had good tests, I would not favor that plan. But were I in charge, I would have invested
sort of an East Asian approach, Korea, Hong Kong.
Well, yes and no. Good tests would be key, and then a epidemiologically sensible lockdown in which the virus was given a chance to be not contagious in any given group, so that you would have hotspots, but you could find them, and the rest of us wouldn't be infecting each other. So I think I had that right, but we don't know because we didn't do that. Lab origin, I think I clearly had right, and I think almost everybody now gets it.
So the other two are early treatment and vaccines.
Early treatment and vaccines, and you asked for vaccines first. I initially was excited about the vaccines. I initially assumed that I would be vaccinated. And Heather and I really became immediately alarmed at the point that the vaccines were announced because of what was said about them, right? Heather and I, because we're biologists, looked at what we were being told about these vaccines. And on the one hand, what a marvelous, fascinating way to vaccinate, right? This is a really radically different way of inducing an immune response. And, in our book, which was finished, we literally emerged from writing the first draft of the book that we then submitted to the publisher. We were in the Ecuador and Amazon finalizing the book. We emerged back to where our phones connected to the world and heard about the novel coronavirus. And so anyway, the book was written before COVID. It has an addendum that includes COVID, but the book is not about COVID. And in the book, we say vaccination is one of three great triumphs of medical technology, right? The other two being surgery and antibiotics. So we're big fans of vaccines, and these vaccines are really fascinating, and we were compelled that it was a pretty interesting idea, but we were absolutely alarmed at being told that they were safe because they couldn't possibly be, right? We didn't know that they did harm, but the point is safe means it doesn't do harm. And the gamble involved in this radical intervention in the immune system was so great that I thought, well, you're telling us that these aren't going to cause autoimmune disorders or tumors or neurological disruptions, right? It was just the number of things that these could induce that you would need years following them to know for sure that they didn't do it. And we were told, oh no, they're safe and we know it. We accelerated the process of testing. These are safe. And it's like, whoa, I know you just lied to me, right? And so the fact that they lied to us and said they were safe when they couldn't possibly know that caused us to think we weren't initially eligible because we're healthy and not that old. And so we were like, okay, we'll wait as long as we can, and we'll give time for an adverse event signal to show up because that's the safer thing to do. And the longer we waited, the more frightening that picture became, right? So what is the state of this discussion? Well, I don't think most of the public has any idea yet how much harm has been done, right? I don't think the public has caught on to the fact that we either have no information on how dangerous they are because the one system we have for collecting that information is now dismissed, or we do know how dangerous they are and it's incredibly dangerous, but we have an adverse event signal that is greater than all of the other vaccines combined, over the course of 30 years. So the signal, we built a system to detect an adverse event signal. That system is firing off, alarms at an unprecedented level, and we're ignoring it. Now, the public does know about myocarditis, and it knows about blood clots, and so it knows that there's some sort of an issue, but it hasn't yet understood how deep the problem is. Hopefully, we will stop gaslighting the injured, and find out how many there are, and find out how sick they are, and find out whether we can treat them. But for the moment, we're still pretending that it's a tiny number of people, which seems very unlikely. And then there's the toughest of all of these, which is early treatment. So we were effectively told that there was, you could either face COVID or you could be vaccinated. Well, that's only because we ignored the medicines that really do work.
Right. And why, I mean, Steve Kirsch was advocating this, and of course I saw the 60 Minutes that covered one of these trials, which was right here in Berkeley, by the way, at the local horse arena, where the workers, you remember this?
Yeah.
The workers got these two different early treatments. So
for fluvoxamine.
Yeah. So what's the deal there?
Well, the deal is unfortunately of a nature that, there are two mutually exclusive ways of viewing it. Either those of us who believe early treatment works are all woefully misinformed and incapable of seeing that we've made an error, or something has spent mightily to prevent information on early treatments that work from making it to your doctor, your pharmacist, the mainstream media. I don't think this is ambiguous at all. The evidence is quite strong, but the sophistication of the campaign that has been marshaled to prevent that information from being understood is stunning.
But it was on, fluvoxamine, is that
Fluvoxamine.
Fluvoxamine was on 60 Minutes, and it was incredibly compelling. So what happened with that particular?
That's a great question. Because so we've got fluvoxamine, which is usually used for depression.
Mm-hmm.
We've got a strong signal that it is very effective against COVID. It's not part of the standard of care.
And why is that?
Because there's no money to be made is the obvious answer.
Because it's a generic at this point? Is that why?
Yeah.
Is the story, I've heard the story where sort of one of the reasons they thought that these drugs or that fluvoxamine or other psychiatric drugs would work was because psychiatric patients were not getting COVID? Is that true, or is that a sort of urban myth?
I don't know. Steve would be the guy to ask about that. I have not been particularly excited about fluvoxamine because I think, by and large, these psychological medications are a Faustian bargain, and we have better drugs. We have drugs that work better than that.
What are those?
Here's where things get very ugly.
Yeah.
There are two primary, and then there are a bunch of other things that seem to contribute.
Okay.
The two are ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine.
Okay.
Now, hydroxychloroquine is one I got wrong. I did not spot that early. I thought, I bought the story, right? At the point that Trump talked about hydroxychloroquine, and then, the scientific chorus erupted and said it doesn't work. We thought it was promising, but it doesn't work. I assumed that made sense. It turns out it doesn't. It's a very important anti-COVID drug with very low toxicity, and the tests that were done actually specifically gave people a toxic dose in order to make the compound unthinkable. But it does, there's very strong evidence that hydroxychloroquine is very effective against COVID. There is equally strong evidence that ivermectin works. Ivermectin has two utilities in this crisis. One of them is that it is extremely effective at treating people who have COVID. Now, the earlier you give it, the better. Mm-hmm. And one of the ways that the evidence for its utility has been obscured is by making what are called underpowered trials that do things like treat people with too little or treat them too late in the course of the disease for it to be effective. But if you treat people early with a sufficient dose, ivermectin turns out to be very effective at keeping people from getting severely ill, and it's extremely low toxicity.
Mm-hmm.
So there's effectively no reason not to give it, and it has been used effectively in many parts of the world to control the pandemic. Now, the really interesting thing about it is because it's so safe as a drug, and it really is among the safest drugs that we have, it can be given without a positive COVID test. In other words, if you think you have COVID, we can just give it to you.
Mm-hmm.
And we're not putting you at significant risk. What's more, because it has prophylactic effectiveness, we can give it to the people you live with and keep them from getting sick. So I did get one thing wrong with ivermectin, which was I put too much weight on a study that came out of Argentina, which said the study was over 1,000 people, and it appeared to be 100% effective. And I thought, well, that's pretty powerful evidence. There was then some concern about the quality of the data. I didn't want to get it wrong, so I actually contacted the primary investigator. I said, can I see the data set? He did not provide the data set, and I became further alarmed that there was something about this study that was unreliable. I believe we now know what happened, which was that this researcher, Hector Carvalho, ran the study, but he ran it as a tally. He didn't keep the data in the way that a proper scientific experiment would. What he basically did was counted numbers of cases of COVID, and it's sloppy.
Mm-hmm.
So when I discovered that that was the case, I went to my audience and I said, look, I have said that this study suggests that this is nearly 100% effective as a prophylactic. I would now rate the quality of this study, I would give it 0 evidentiary weight, and that changes the overall picture for ivermectin's value a bit, but not much.
Mm-hmm.
So I got that wrong, and I got hydroxychloroquine wrong, and I got masks wrong. But other than that, I think I got just about everything right.
And so what's the what do your critics accuse you of? And what is your response to your critics?
My response to my critics is that they don't actually know what they're talking about.
But what is their criticism? What is their criticism of you? And then what's
the criticism? The one that is most intense at this point is you got ivermectin wrong. We now know it doesn't work, and you, for reasons of pride or because you made money or something like this, won't admit it. Now, frankly, even at this late date, if I thought ivermectin didn't work, the best thing I could do for my family, for my future, would be to say, hey, I got this one wrong. Here's how it happened, but it doesn't work. It's just not the case. It does work. And the fact that people have been kept from having access to this drug and then been left with a choice. Do you want to be vaccinated or not? When the real choice is, of the available treatments and preventatives, which is the best from the point of view of the cost-benefit analysis, right? Likely, for almost everybody, and maybe even for everybody, these vaccines were far too radical in their mechanism of action to be contemplated. And for most people, they could be kept safe with these alternatives. The problem is, there wasn't any money to be made. Now,
and so is the disagreement about the evidence turn on this issue of not prescribing ivermectin soon enough or at high enough dosages?
Well, have you heard of the Together trial?
No.
Okay. You probably did run across it at the point that it finally emerged. So the Together trial was a complex trial that tested many different drugs, including fluvoxamine. This is where the fluvoxamine evidence comes from, or at least the primary evidence. Anyway, tested many drugs against placebo. And supposedly, we knew 8 months ago now that the result for ivermectin was not statistically, they used a different kind of statistics, but it was not statistically significant in favor of ivermectin, which is not the same thing as saying ivermectin doesn't work, but it is a negative result.
Right.
We didn't see the study for 7 months. We saw the headline. We saw, slides from a PowerPoint presentation that said, no, ivermectin is not effective at keeping people safe and keeping them from getting very sick. 7 months later, the actual paper is published, and we're able to finally scrutinize what was done. And it's insane, right? I mean, there are things built into this trial that still have not been explained that absolutely sabotage it, right? Like there's a weight cutoff for the dosing. So the dosage that the paper says that they give is a viable dose, but they cut it off and they don't keep increasing it the heavier you are. And so the point is, what this does is it takes people who are the most vulnerable to COVID and underdoses them, right? So anyway, the point is, the public got the headline 7 months before they got the paper. They read the title of the paper, they read the abstract, but until you get to the methods section and start asking questions about, well, what exactly was done in this study and what effect would that have on a drug that works, it dramatically underpowered the trial. What's more, the evidence that the Together trial produced does suggest that ivermectin is effective. In fact, the PI, who's the first author on this paper, says that he believes if they had added more patients to the trial, they would have shown a positive effect for ivermectin, right? He said it's a matter of the size of the study, not the effectiveness of the drug. He said that to Steve Kirsch in an email. Okay? So this is not evidence that people think it is of the drug's ineffectiveness. It's evidence of what happens if you underpower a trial with an effective drug is you still get an effect. What's more interesting is that this isn't the only time we've seen this issue where the person that supposedly generated the evidence that says that the drug isn't effective privately says something very different, right? The other time we saw this was the meta-analysis done by Andrew Hill. So there were two major meta-analyses on ivermectin. There was one from the Bird Group headed by Tess Laurie in Britain, said ivermectin is extremely effective at preventing people from getting seriously ill, going into the hospital, and dying. And then the other meta-analysis was Andrew Hill's that said it wasn't effective. Tess Laurie had a Zoom call that she recorded with Andrew Hill in which he acknowledges that ivermectin works and that he thought he was pressured. He says he was pressured by Unitaid to change the conclusion of his meta-analysis, and he hoped that it would be 6 weeks before he had more data so that he could change the conclusion back to saying that ivermectin works. So it's the same pattern again and again. Every time you look deeply into these supposedly conclusive studies that suggest it doesn't work, you discover there's some sort of shenanigans going on where the PI believes something different than what's in the paper, and the evidence in the paper actually does suggest that there's an effect. So how many of these do we need to see before we just realize somebody doesn't want the evidence to conclude that ivermectin works?
And do you think that this is motivated by a concern that if people were using ivermectin, then they wouldn't get vaccinated?
I'm a little hesitant. I think it's clear what's going on. I think what's going on is so ghastly that for me to say it raises issues of credibility.
Oh, come on, say it.
I will, but you realize those people, when they hear me say it, they'll think, oh.
Well, you can edit it out if you don't want, right?
I won't edit it out.
Okay.
But I do think pharma is not in the business that you and I think they're in, right? Pharma is in the business of selling compounds for which it has intellectual property rights that it can plausibly argue are useful for conditions that people want treated, right? It is not in the business of making people healthier or safer. And unfortunately, there were several drugs that were already out of patent, highly effective, and very safe that would have taken what turned out to be a many $100 billion new market and killed it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not a conspiracy in the sense that there's a profit motivation you're describing, which is that they wanted to sell a lot of vaccines and they saw cheaper alternatives.
Well, the problem is, if I'm right, then it implies an indifference to human suffering and death that is pretty hard to fathom.
Yeah, I guess to be devil's advocate, I guess you could sort of say, well, I mean, when I look at this stuff, like, for example, the school lockdowns, where the teachers union in California, so we had a lockdown, from 2020 to 2021. Europe was sending back the kids to school. Are the teachers in California, were they indifferent to the impact that shutting down the schools would have on kids? No, I mean, I think they cared. They were just more obsessed with their own health and safety than they were. And they make up reasons about how the kids would be educated over Zoom, and it would be just the same. I mean, people find all sorts of ways to justify things that they want.
They do. Unfortunately, if you're in the business of rapidly generating a radically novel vaccine because you believe that a pathogen is so dangerous that it requires extraordinary investment to shut it down, and in the same breath you are intervening in people's access to a common medication that many have built successful medical protocols around treating their own patients. It's hard for me to imagine the rationalization that would actually involve those who did it not understanding that they were condemning likely millions to death.
Mm-hmm. What help me understand, where do you sit in relationships? There's a bunch of COVID dissidents. There's Vinay Prasad, UC San Francisco. There's Carity. What's his first name?
You mean Aaron?
Yeah, Aaron
Kheriaty.
Aaron Kheriaty. There's Jay Bhattacharya.
Yeah.
And who else am I missing? These are some of the big...
Robert Malone. Garrett Vanden Bosch.
How do you, like...
Ryan Cole.
Yeah, like, what is the state of play among the dissidents? I mean, Vinay strikes me as fairly mainstream, but he's also harshly critical of the public health establishment. Where do you sit in relationship to these other guys?
I'm very troubled by Vinay. As much as I want him to be a good guy on the right side of history, the way he divides this puzzle makes no sense to me.
Which is how?
He sees certain issues very clearly, and then other issues he...
What do you disagree with him on?
The wisdom of vaccinating anyone, right? The utility of ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine. So
he doesn't support ivermectin or...
No, and he has... So I see him on both sides of this issue. And the places that he's right, I want to cheer him on. And the places where he's wrong, I just think, how can somebody who sees part of this picture so clearly miss so much?
Mm-hmm.
And I'll tell you, I mean, maybe I'm just round the bend, but my sense is that there is what I call middle ground scramble. The middle ground scramble is on. And the point is, if you imagine that something endeavored to prevent the best treatments from reaching the public in order for it to sell reckless and expensive treatments and, in fact, to mandate them, well, that thing needs to be scolded. And all of the people who fell for it need a way out. And so the last thing any of these people want is for the dissidents to have been right.
Mm-hmm.
Right? If the dissidents were right, then the reckoning that is coming is a thing to be feared.
Right.
So what they want is somebody nicely positioned in the middle. Somebody who will scold those who did wrong, but, slap on the wrist level, and will not validate the dissident perspective, so we can still dismiss those dangerous people who spread misinformation, right? And unfortunately, what I see is Vinay exploring this space. And I don't know that he knows what he's doing, but I think the point is there is a hunger for somebody who was not part of the bullshit CDC narrative, somebody who saw through it to say, oh, but those COVID dissidents, they were wrong as can be. And whoever figures out the dimension of that niche is going to be very powerful and very well rewarded, because it lets the perpetrators off pretty much scot-free. The ill-gotten gains will remain in their bank accounts, and the service of doing away with us dissidents will be part of the bargain. Mm-hmm. So anyway, I'm not very pleased with that middle ground scramble thing. I see it as its own pathology. But, I think the community of dissidents contains some really fine doctors and some very good scientists. And we also, have discovered who has the courage to say what they see and who doesn't. Mm-hmm. Should we move on to the